The chamber was heavy with silence, the kind of silence that feels alive, waiting for something to break it. Cameras rolled, pens hovered, and the nation's eyes were fixed on one of the highest seats of power in America. From the bench, Judge Clarence Thomas leaned back with that familiar air of untouchable authority, lips curling into a smirk that carried more weight than any gavel. With a casual, almost dismissive tone, he questioned not the argument, not the evidence, but Jasmine Crockett herself. His words sliced through the air, mocking her legal background, ridiculing her qualifications, turning decades of study, practice, and sacrifice into the punchline of his performance. A few chuckles rippled across the chamber. For a moment, it seemed like the imbalance of power was absolute. One of the longest-serving justices, cloaked in prestige, mocking a freshman congresswoman daring to step into his arena. The cameras caught the look in Crockett's eyes. A calm fire. The kind of composure that tells you the storm is still gathering. To the casual observer, it looked like a mismatch. Thomas, the titan of the bench, armed with decades of establishment power. Crockett, younger, newer, without the institutional armor that shields men like him. But beneath that surface clash was a deeper story, one about arrogance and dismissal on one side, and resilience and unshakable dignity on the other. Viewers watching at home felt the sting. They knew this wasn't just about Crockett. It was about every time someone's intelligence had been reduced to a joke, every time their identity or experience was waved away as unworthy. The smirk on Thomas's face wasn't only his. It was the smirk of every gatekeeper who ever said, "You don't belong here." But something shifted in that moment. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't rush to defend herself, nor did she bow her head. She let the words hang, let the silence stretch, let the arrogance echo against the walls until it began to sound hollow. And then, as the room braced for more dismissal, she prepared to speak. The titan had mocked. The chamber had laughed. But the fire in her eyes told another story, and no one in that room expected what she would say next. Why did this moment matter so much? Why did a single smirk, a single mocking remark from Clarence Thomas reverberate far beyond the walls of that chamber? Because it wasn't just about one woman being insulted. It was about whether the voices of new leaders, especially those carrying the weight of communities long excluded, were allowed to be taken seriously in the halls of American power. At its core, this was a question about credibility, about who gets to speak for the people and who gets told to sit down. Jasmine Crockett was no stranger to this battle. Before she ever walked into Congress, she had already carved out a career as a trial lawyer, defending those who couldn't afford polished representation. She had stood in Texas courtrooms fighting for civil rights, immigration protections, and voting access in a state that often tried to silence them. She was in every sense forged in the fire of representing the marginalized. Every client who had been overlooked, every case dismissed before it was heard, had prepared her for the way Thomas tried to belittle her now. And then there was Clarence Thomas, the longest-serving justice on the Supreme Court, a man whose rulings had altered the trajectory of American rights. For decades, his decisions shaped everything from affirmative action to voting rights, often narrowing the protections that communities like the ones Crockett fought for had relied upon. To many, Thomas symbolized the old guard, insulated, untouchable, wielding immense power but seemingly deaf to the struggles outside marble walls. His controversies, from questions of ethics to his alignment with the court's most conservative wing, were part of a long story of a man who had risen to power but left entire communities behind. So when he smirked and mocked her credentials, it wasn't just a personal slight. It was history repeating itself, the powerful dismissing the new, the entrenched sneering at the rising, the gatekeeper ridiculing the challenger. That's why the air in the chamber felt so heavy, why viewers across the nation sat forward in their chairs. They weren't just watching a clash of personalities. They were witnessing a symbolic trial of dignity itself. And here's the truth. Moments like this decide more than reputations. They decide how millions watching at home feel about their own place in this country. If Crockett faltered, the message would be clear. Mockery wins, power silences, truth has no defense. But if she stood tall, If she flipped that smirk into silence, the ripple effect would go far beyond Washington. It would reach every person who had ever been told their education wasn't enough. Their accent made them unworthy. Their background disqualified them. That's why the tension crackled like electricity. This wasn't just another jab. This was a test of dignity on the national stage. And while Clarence Thomas thought he had the upper hand, Jasmine Crockett wasn't about to simply defend herself. She was preparing to flip the entire script, and in doing so, she would make history. To understand the weight of Clarence Thomas's smirk, you have to understand the man behind it, the history he carries, the power he wields, and the controversies that have followed him for decades. Clarence Thomas is not just another judge. He is the longest-serving member of the Supreme Court, a figure who has occupied one of the most consequential seats in American democracy for more than 30 years. With every opinion, every dissent, every quiet alignment with the conservative bloc, he has shaped the legal and cultural landscape of the nation. And yet, for much of his tenure, Thomas was defined not by what he said, but by what he didn't. For years, he earned the reputation of being the silent justice. While his colleagues engaged in fierce questioning during oral arguments, Thomas sat in silence, often going entire sessions without uttering a single word. To some, this silence suggested deep contemplation. To others, it felt like detachment. A man in one of the most powerful roles in the country, refusing to engage in the very debates that defined the court's purpose. But silence does not mean absence. Behind the quiet exterior, Thomas became a reliable anchor for the most conservative interpretations of law. He opposed affirmative action, took narrow views on voting rights, and aligned himself with rulings that restricted protections many communities depended on. In case after case, his decisions seemed to tilt the scales away from the vulnerable and toward entrenched interests. Then came the controversies, questions about his ethics, his relationships with wealthy donors, the appearance of gifts and favors that sparked outrage across the nation. Each revelation chipped away at the perception of impartiality the court is meant to uphold. Critics saw not a neutral arbiter of justice, but a man insulated by lifetime appointment, shielded from accountability while exercising immense influence over the rights of millions. And so, when Clarence Thomas finally broke his silence, not in a reasoned argument, but in a mocking dismissal of Jasmine Crockett's legal skills, the irony was sharp. Here was a man who had spoken so little in the courtroom, suddenly finding his voice to belittle a rising leader. It wasn't the voice of wisdom or guidance. It was the voice of entitlement, of an elite figure laughing at someone he assumed was beneath him. For many, that smirk represented decades of frustration. It was the culmination of watching an entrenched figure hold immense sway while disregarding the lived realities of those outside the marble halls. The arrogance wasn't new. It was simply laid bare in a way that could not be ignored, and that's why this moment mattered. Because arrogance has a way of revealing itself, of slipping through even the most carefully constructed facades. Thomas believed his position made him untouchable, his words beyond challenge. But history shows that arrogance carries its own weakness. It underestimates those who have been counted out, those who rise from the margins with a fire that cannot be extinguished. Clarence Thomas had mocked. He had smirked. He had thrown his weight against Jasmine Crockett as though she were another voice to silence. But arrogance always underestimates the one thing it can't control: truth. Before Jasmine Crockett ever stood in that chamber facing the smirk of Clarence Thomas, she had already lived through the kinds of battles that shape unshakable resolve. Her story is not one of privilege or shortcuts. It is one of grit, persistence, and a relentless refusal to be silenced. Born into modest means, Crockett's path was defined early by a clear-eyed understanding of injustice. She didn't come from a family that wielded influence in the corridors of power. She came from the kind of community where resilience was not a choice, it was survival. That perspective shaped her ambition. It wasn't about climbing a political ladder. It was about fighting for the people she saw too often left behind. Her journey began in law. Crockett earned her degree and stepped into the courtroom not as a detached attorney chasing prestige, but as an advocate for the marginalized. In Texas, she represented clients who couldn't afford powerful firms or expensive legal defenses. She defended voting rights cases, immigration cases, and those who stood at the mercy of a system stacked against them. For Crockett, the law wasn't a theory. It was a weapon she wielded on behalf of those who had none. She built her reputation on standing tall in places where others were too afraid to speak. In courtrooms where the odds were stacked and the judges unsympathetic, she held her ground. In communities told their voices didn't matter, she amplified them. That foundation in advocacy set her apart, not just as a lawyer, but as someone deeply rooted in the struggles of ordinary people. Then came politics. Texas is no easy landscape for progressives, and yet Crockett entered the fray undaunted. She ran for the state legislature, taking on entrenched interests and a system often hostile to her values. She spoke about equity, about the dignity of immigrants, about the right of every person to have their voice heard. In a state where pushing back often means being drowned out, Crockett refused to yield. Her tenure in the Texas House of Representatives showcased her courage. She stood in debates where her opponents outnumbered her, where rhetoric ran hot and tempers flared. She endured mockery, dismissal, and endless attempts to minimize her influence. Yet time and again, she held her composure and fired back with sharp, fact-driven arguments that commanded attention. Her colleagues may not have always agreed with her, but they learned quickly. Jasmine Crockett was not to be underestimated. That same tenacity carried her to Congress. When she arrived in Washington, she carried with her the spirit of her community, the immigrant families she had defended, the voters fighting for their rights, the workers overlooked by systems of privilege. She did not come to blend into the marble halls or to soften her convictions for the sake of decorum. She came to fight, to legislate, and to remind America that the underestimated deserve their place at the table. And it is precisely because she was underestimated that she resonated with so many. Crockett embodies authenticity in an age when politics often feels scripted. She is sharp, unapologetic, and deeply human. Her intelligence is matched by her ability to connect, to make the law feel less like an abstract force and more like a tool for liberation. She carries the scars of her battles proudly, not as wounds, but as proof of survival and victory. So when Clarence Thomas smirked, mocking her credentials, it was not the first time someone tried to reduce her to less than she was. She had been doubted in Texas courtrooms. She had been dismissed in legislative debates. She had been told in countless ways that she didn't belong, and each time she proved them wrong. Each dismissal became fuel. Each slight became preparation. Her journey wasn't just about building a career. It was about building armor forged from struggle, compassion, and an unshakable belief in justice. It was about learning to keep composure under attack, to turn insults into opportunities, to transform arrogance into silence. And that is why, in that chamber, Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She had been here before, not in the literal sense, but in spirit. She had fought this fight on smaller stages, with fewer witnesses, with higher stakes for those she represented. Every courtroom, every debate, every injustice prepared her for this exact moment. The smirk on Clarence Thomas's face was not new. It was simply louder, more public, more amplified by the weight of his office. And Crockett was more than ready for it, because while Thomas thought he was mocking her, he was really summoning the full force of her journey. And what came next would prove just how dangerous it is to underestimate Jasmine Crockett. The smirk didn't fade. If anything, it grew bolder, feeding on the silence that followed his jab. Clarence Thomas leaned back, radiating the confidence of someone who had occupied his throne for decades, unchallenged and untouchable. He doubled down, sharpening his dismissal, suggesting that Crockett's grasp of the law was surface level at best. His tone was not the voice of inquiry, but of mockery, a man flexing power simply because he could. The words landed heavy, and the chamber reacted. Murmurs spread like ripples across still water. Some shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with the brazenness of it all. Others tried to stifle grins, enjoying the theater of a seasoned justice cutting down a younger congresswoman. But the loudest reaction was the silence, the tense, electric quiet of a room waiting to see if Crockett would break. She didn't. Jasmine Crockett sat poised, shoulders back, eyes locked on Thomas with a steadiness that seemed almost defiant in its calm. She let the moment breathe. Let the arrogance echo. She refused to rush into defense, refused to let his timeline dictate her response. In that pause, the power began to shift, almost imperceptibly. What looked at first like her silence of defeat revealed itself as silence of calculation. It was the kind of duel where one fighter flailed wildly, convinced the match was already won, while the other stood motionless, waiting for the perfect opening. Crockett was the latter, still composed, her silence louder than his derision. Observers felt the tension rising. Was she intimidated? Was she about to crumble under the weight of his authority? The doubt hung in the air, and that was exactly what Thomas expected. For decades, his stature had been shield enough. Challengers rarely met him head-on, but the glimmer in Crockett's eyes told another story. She wasn't retreating. She was preparing. The atmosphere shifted. What began as one man's mockery turned into a collective anticipation. Every person in the room, whether they realized it or not, was leaning toward her. The chamber had become an arena, and all the theatrics of Thomas's condescension had set the stage for something more powerful than he could imagine. She had absorbed the blow, not with weakness but with restraint, and that restraint was dangerous, for it meant she wasn't scrambling to defend herself. She was waiting to strike with precision. Clarence Thomas continued, layering on smug commentary, the kind that carried more bite than substance. His words dripped with the tone of dismissal, as if the debate were already over. But arrogance has a way of digging its own grave. Every added remark, every mocking inflection, only amplified the suspense, only heightened the hunger in the room to see what Jasmine Crockett would do. The murmurs quieted again, the stillness returning deeper this time. Even those predisposed to side with Thomas could feel it, the balance shifting, the stage set for a reversal. Crockett's patience had turned her into the center of gravity, the eye of the storm, and then, just as the tension reached its breaking point, just as the chamber collectively held its breath, Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, lips parting with deliberate calm, and then, with the entire room bracing for another insult, Crockett began. Jasmine Crockett didn't rush. She didn't snap back with the kind of raw anger her critics might have expected. Instead, she began with the kind of composure that unsettles the arrogant. Her voice was measured, deliberate, the cadence of someone who knew she had the room now, and she intended to use it. "Justice Thomas," she said, her words carrying an edge of steel hidden inside velvet. "You've questioned my understanding of the law. Let me remind you where I come from." The chamber leaned in. Every syllable was deliberate. She spoke not as a novice being lectured, but as a lawyer who had stood in real courtrooms, with real lives at stake, where decisions meant freedom or prison, opportunity or despair. "I didn't cut my teeth in ivory towers. Insulated from consequence," she continued. "I cut my teeth defending the people you've overlooked, families fighting to stay together, citizens fighting for the right to vote, workers whose dignity was on the line. These weren't hypotheticals. These weren't abstract principles. These were human beings whose survival depended on someone knowing the law better than the people trying to strip their rights away." A murmur rippled through the room, half astonishment, half anticipation. Crockett wasn't merely defending herself. She was reframing the battle. Thomas's smirk flickered, if only for a moment. She pressed on, layering fact upon fact, like a prosecutor dismantling a witness. "Yes, I am young compared to your tenure, but my record speaks for itself. Dozens of cases fought in Texas courts. Laws challenged that were designed to suppress the very voters who entrusted me with this office. Legislation written to protect communities who never had the luxury of being heard here. And unlike some, I didn't inherit this platform. I earned it." Gasps, subtle but unmistakable. The crowd was shifting. Thomas's dismissal was losing its gravity against the weight of her truth. She paused. Silence stretched, purposeful. In debate, silence is a weapon. She wielded it expertly, letting her words linger in the air, giving them time to cut deeper than any insult ever could. And then, the pivot. The shift from defense to offense. "What troubles me, Justice Thomas, isn't that you question me. What troubles me is that you question the very people I represent. When you dismiss my legal skills, you're not just mocking me. You're mocking the communities that raised me, the citizens who sent me here, the voices who entrusted me to stand on their behalf. And with all due respect, their voices matter just as much as yours. The chamber froze. Even the faint shuffling of papers stopped. It was the kind of moment when everyone knew they were witnessing a reversal, when the underdog seizes the momentum and the giant stumbles. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. The smirk was gone now, replaced with the tight-lipped stillness of someone unaccustomed to being challenged so directly. Crockett didn't relent. You've sat in silence for years on the bench, saying nothing while the rights of millions were debated. And now you've chosen to speak, not to illuminate the law, not to defend justice, but to belittle. If that is the best use of your voice, then I'll gladly use mine to remind this country what true service looks like. The blow landed. Gasps gave way to low, stunned murmurs. Crockett's words were no longer just a counterpunch. They were a recalibration of the power dynamic itself. She wasn't standing beneath Thomas. She was standing level, eye to eye, daring him to dismiss her again. She leaned in, her tone sharpening. You can mock my experience. You can smirk at my credentials, but you cannot erase the truth that I am here, elected by the people, sworn to defend the Constitution, and committed to the same oath you took. And unlike mockery, that oath means something to me. Applause wasn't permitted in the chamber, but the energy in the air was undeniable. Even those who disagreed with her politics could feel it. The undeniable force of someone seizing their moment. And then came the final turn. The moment that transformed a counterattack into something larger. I am not here to match arrogance with arrogance. I am here to remind every young woman, every immigrant family, every American who has been told they don't belong, that dignity doesn't ask for permission. It takes its place. And no smirk, no insult, no dismissal will ever change that. The room fell into a silence that was heavier than applause, more powerful than protest. It was the silence of respect. The kind that no one can fake, the kind that must be earned. Thomas sat still, his authority intact on paper but fractured in presence. Crockett had not only defended herself, she had turned his mockery into a national moment. She had flipped the script. What began as a jab at her competence became a spotlight on his arrogance, and that was the brilliance of it. Crockett's words transcended the chamber. They weren't confined to that confrontation. They were destined for screens across America to be clipped, shared, replayed, and remembered. Because her speech wasn't just about her, it was about everyone watching who had ever been underestimated. In that chamber, David had faced Goliath. And with nothing but her words, Jasmine Crockett had landed the stone. But if Thomas thought the moment would fade away quietly, he was gravely mistaken. The moment Jasmine Crockett finished speaking, the chamber sat in stunned silence. But outside those marble walls, the silence didn't last long. Within minutes, clips of her words hit social media. First a shaky phone recording, then polished feeds from news outlets, and then the tidal wave. Hashtags, memes, captions that carried her voice into millions of homes. Crockett clapped back. Dignity wins. Smirk no more. They trended within hours, flooding timelines from Twitter to TikTok, spreading faster than any prepared soundbite ever could. The image of Clarence Thomas's fading smirk, juxtaposed with Crockett's calm fire, became the meme of the moment. Users paired it with captions like, "When the teacher thinks you didn't do the reading but you wrote the book," and "David 1, Goliath 0. But beneath the humor was something more powerful. Pride. People who had never heard Crockett's name before were now retweeting her lines, quoting her pauses, replaying the moment she flipped arrogance into silence. It wasn't just political junkies or legal scholars, it was teachers, nurses, truck drivers, immigrant families, and students who felt like they had seen themselves represented in her calm defiance. Commentators scrambled to weigh in. Cable news anchors replayed the clip on loop, some with admiration, others with disbelief. Legal analysts broke it down frame by frame, dissecting not just what Crockett said, but how she said it. The cadence, the pauses, the way her restraint set the trap for Thomas's arrogance to collapse in on itself. For days, the segment dominated headlines, becoming the litmus test of where one stood, with the entrenched elite who sneered, or with the rising voices who refused to be silenced. Celebrities amplified the moment. Musicians posted the clip with fire emojis, actors stitched it into TikTok skits, and authors called it the speech of a generation. Even athletes joined in, comparing Crockett's takedown to a buzzer beater or a knockout punch. The ripple effect was undeniable. Crockett's words weren't just politics, they had become culture. And then came the ordinary citizens, whose voices mattered most. A single mother posted that her daughter had watched the clip and said, "That looks like us." A young law student wrote, "For the first time, I feel like I belong in this field." An immigrant father commented, "We tell our kids to stay calm when people mock them. Now I can show them why." These stories weren't just anecdotes. They were proof that Crockett's moment resonated on a level deeper than the headlines. It was collective vindication. For every person who had ever been underestimated, dismissed, or mocked, Crockett's words were more than a counterpunch. They were a rallying cry. They turned what could have been a fleeting insult into a national moment of pride and defiance. And Clarence Thomas? His silence afterward became its own headline. Analysts noted the irony. A man who had spent decades silent on the bench finally spoke up, and in doing so, handed the microphone to the very person he tried to belittle. His smirk had backfired, his mockery immortalized not as a show of strength, but as the setup for Crockett's triumph. Still, as the hashtags trended and the memes multiplied, there was a sense that this moment wasn't just viral fodder. It was bigger than that. Something was shifting, something cultural, something historical. Jasmine Crockett had taken a jab and transformed it into a statement, not just for herself, but for a nation wrestling with questions of dignity, identity, and power. And yet, beyond the headlines and memes, there was something deeper. Do you want me to move into Section 8, the resolution moral lesson, 700 words, where Crockett's message expands into a universal reflection? In the days that followed, Jasmine Crockett refused to gloat. She didn't replay the viral clip or lean into the flood of memes that crowned her the winner. Instead, she reframed the moment for what it truly was. Not a duel of personalities, but a lesson in power, dignity, and what it means to serve the people. Her words after the exchange struck a chord. Integrity will always outweigh mockery, and courage will always rise above elitism. That principle had carried her from small courtrooms in Texas to the national stage, and now it resonated with millions who saw themselves in her struggle. Crockett showed that strength isn't loud arrogance. It's the quiet resolve to speak truth even when the odds seem stacked. This was about more than one chamber, more than one clash. It tapped into the essence of democracy itself. America's promise has always been tested by those who cling to power, dismissing new voices as unworthy. But time and again, progress emerges from the underestimated. From abolitionists dismissed as dreamers, to suffragettes laughed out of halls of power, to civil rights leaders mocked as naive, every generation's arc bent forward because ordinary people refused to be silenced. Crockett's moment was not an exception. It was the continuation of that lineage. Her rise carried the reminder that democracy is not preserved by titles or robes, but by the courage of those willing to challenge them. She embodied a simple but profound truth. The measure of leadership isn't the ability to belittle, it's the ability to uplift. When Clarence Thomas smirked, he represented the old guard, clinging to authority through dismissal. When Crockett answered, she represented the people, standing steady, insisting that dignity is non-negotiable. And that is why her moment mattered. Because every teacher who's been told their students can't achieve, every immigrant parent who's been underestimated, every young woman of color who's been told you don't belong here, they could watch that chamber and see validation. Crockett's strength was not just her own. It was shared strength, drawn from the people who raised her, the communities she served, and the countless Americans who had walked a similar path of being underestimated, only to rise higher. The inspirational crescendo was undeniable. This wasn't simply a personal victory. It was a communal one. It was proof that integrity can cut sharper than insult, that resilience can outlast arrogance, and that even in the most powerful rooms in America, The voice of the underestimated can reset the balance. Because in the end, it wasn't just her victory, it was a victory for every American who has ever been underestimated. Clarence Thomas mocked. Jasmine Crockett shut him down. The title of this story isn't just a headline, it's the truth of what we all witnessed. In that chamber, arrogance met resilience, and resilience won. What began as a smirk ended as a moment that millions will remember, the day dignity spoke louder than mockery. But here's the thing, this story is bigger than one exchange. It's about what we allow in our democracy. Do we let voices be dismissed, or do we stand with those who demand to be heard? Crockett's victory belongs not just to her, but to every person who has ever been underestimated, ignored, or told to sit down. That's why sharing this story matters. Every clip, every repost, every conversation that sparks because of this moment chips away at the old narrative that power belongs only to the few. You can be part of rewriting that story. You can be part of ensuring that no voice, no community, and no dream is silenced. So if this moment inspired you, don't let it stop here. Subscribe, share, and add your voice to the movement for dignity and justice. Because the more we lift up stories like this, the stronger we become together. This isn't just entertainment, it's history unfolding in real time. And you have the chance to carry it forward. Because the story isn't over. It's only just begun.